For $379 US, you can grab a lot of EMs. More than 50% of the EMs are in the lower than this price range. So what does the YanYin Canon 2 has to offer for exactly this price range? Well, it has 5 drivers in total, 1 dynamic driver, 4 balanced armatures, 2 balanced armatures for mids and highs, and 2 balanced armatures for just the highs. Today we are reviewing one of the most beautiful looking EMs that I've seen in my entire life. Beauty is something very subjective. I'm saying this not because I want to make the video controversial, but because I've been at a little audiophile meetup and I had handed this one to a friend who is from China. And my friend has said that he doesn't like the design of this. He didn't like the design of iBass or IT05 either, which was surprising to me because those two are the most aesthetically pleasing EMs that I have in my collection. If I was to call something which isn't quite as aesthetically pleasing, here we have the Campfire Audio Cascara. This is a nice EM, it has superb comfort, it is a really neat EM, but I think that the design is much simpler, which doesn't really do so much for me. It has a very simple and basic design, so I think that the YanYin Canon 2 is much prettier. I really like the shells, I really like the overall design, and I like the cable too. Although the cable that I got is with a 3.5mm single-ended connector, I was able to explore them quite a bit because they're pretty easy to drive. You don't need a headphone amplifier that is strong to drive this pair of EMs. EMs usually means in-ear monitors, and we usually use this word to define something which comes with silicone tips. So it doesn't mean that they are necessarily made for monitoring music or for concerts, but they can be pretty good for that too. The Canon 2 has 2 switches at the back, which mainly affect the bass reproduction. They are electronic crossover switches. I have them as they came out of the factory doing the review to give you the most accurate representation of what you are going to experiment. They don't have a major impact on bass, so if you don't like their signature at first, they will just decrease the amount of bass, basically. We do have a sound which is natural, which is somewhat sloppy in the bass when there is a lot of bass in the music, but when there is not a lot of bass in the music, when the song is more linear, more neutral, the bass of the Canon 2 is very neutral, flat, and it just is transparent, so it shows you what the music had in it originally, which is a very interesting approach because most EMs will impose some kind of character on the sound, while the Canon 2, it allows the music to shine as it is. So there are songs which have a very flat, overexposed bass, which sounds very shallow. For example, Fire and Ice from Mori Calliope and Takanashi Kiara has that kind of very shallow bass which kind of breaks down, it explodes, but it doesn't really reach well in the sublows. I appreciate the fact that the Canon 2 doesn't change that, it just presents that bass as it is, while songs from One True God or other bands which are with dubstep, for example Virtual Riot or bands that have a lot of bass will be presented as such. You will hear the whole width and depth of the bass with every single band. The midrange is natural, it is a very natural midrange. It has a good focus on both the lower midrange and the upper midrange. Basically, it can present pretty well both male and female voices, although there is a tiny hint of bass bleed in the midrange, which emphasizes the male voices a bit, it gives them more substance, it thickens the whole midrange a bit, so it gives midrange a bit of extra thickness, it gives the midrange a fair amount of impact, and it allows the midrange to sound corpulent, even if the song has a brighter, more harsher mixing and mastering. This is actually useful because a lot of music hasn't been properly mixed and mastered, or it was done so using a pair of headphones or EMs which were colored in some way. And Canon 2 doesn't sanctionize those. It allows the music to sound good even if the original mixing and mastering was done quite poorly. The treble is bright, sharp, explosive, airy, and well extended. This is the kind of treble that I like, so you may think that they have a somewhat V-shaped or a somewhat U-shaped sound, but that isn't quite true, because the midrange is also presented quite forward, there is a good presence of voices in the music, and the soundstage that the Canon 2 creates is natural. It has a natural width, a natural depth, and a natural height. It is presented pretty circularly around the listener. It is not extremely wide, it is not expanded with an exaggeration on the sides, but it has a good instrument separation, it is pretty clean in the whole presentation, and there is no scattering, there is no smearing either, so you don't get a smeared presentation where instruments are just all pushed together, but you don't get scattering either, so they aren't scattered in space. It is a pretty natural, pretty honest presentation which works well with most music, so they will sound quite good for both jazz, classical, rock, everything will just sound natural. I think that they are best with pop, with commercial music, and with new music, because usually this kind of music has a pretty strong bass, and the Canon 2 is able to reproduce that quite accurately. With songs which really have a lot of bass, for example, dubstep, infected mushroom, and pretty bassy songs, I can feel my whole jawbone rattle when they are turned loud. They also have a good overall performance, both listened quietly and listened loudly, which is pretty recommendable because usually headphones will either sound best at high or at low volumes. Nothing really sounds good all across the range. With Canon 2 they sound best at medium volumes, where they have the best overall refinement, resolution and detail, but they don't get overbearing either. So at low volumes they tend to become smoother, leaner and laid back. They are relaxed and they provide a more relaxed overall character, but still with good resolution, while at loud volumes they become brighter, harsher, more forward, and they have more impact, and they also have wall of sound overall presentation. If you are listening to a lot of rock, they will give you that wall of sound, punchy presentation, but that will not work so well for pop, for example, where it can sound a bit overdriven. So at very loud volumes they can sound a bit overdriven. That is because the dynamic driver only handles the bass, while the mid-range and the treble is handled by balanced armatures, which don't handle very high volumes quite as well as a dynamic driver. Since they have a dynamic driver, you may be concerned that they have driver flex, but that is not true. They do not have driver flex because they have ventilation at the back, and the ventilation ports have colored coding. So the left earphone has a blue ring around the ventilation port, while the right earphone has a red ring around the ventilation port. The cables are detachable, and I've just forgot to mention the beautiful transport case. Just look at this. This is a very solid leatherette, so there is no real leather, but very solid transport case. You can actually punch the transport case and the EMs on the inside will still be in one piece. This is quite good because I typically like to have a pair of EMs, throw this in my backpack and go. So when I take a pair of EMs, I want them to be protected. Usually I use aftermarket third-party cases like those from DD Hi-Fi, which offer very good protection, although this one, the solid type, is the best type of case to have for your EMs. At the end of the day, who is the Canon 2 made for? It is made for those with a varied music collection. So nothing can be quite as good as being versatile at producing a sound which is pleasing with both rock, EDM, metal, but also with classical, jazz, even with down-tempo music. The Canon 2 can reproduce basically everything. It is a master at dubstep at most, and at rap and at electronic music, but it can really play everything else really nicely, and that is the best part with them. Nothing will sound bad, everything will sound good, nothing will be in its own character. The bass will always be a tiny bit sloppy, especially in the bass you'll hear a wet character where it does this poop, like it doesn't go pop, it goes a bloop, a bit sloppy, but otherwise it is a very high performance EM. I enjoyed this quite a lot. It has a very natural tonality and timbre, which allow me to listen to my favorite rock songs, Metallica, especially Saint Anger, I like that album, and other bands like Protest the Hero or Pierce the Veil, or for example Alessana. So they work well with emo, they work well with metal, they work well with me. I like them quite a lot. I think that if you generally like a big bass, a strong bass, because most of your music has a pretty strong bass, you will like the YanYin Canon 2. I hope that you also liked my video. I hope you liked the new presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope we'll see each other really soon. Bye bye!